This week we've got some lighting setups to go through, this time using 3 lights. Hello, my name is Cade and this is DSLRguide. So I think one of the best ways to learn lighting is to look at a shot and break it down in terms of each light so you can really see what each light is doing. So that's the plan. Now I've already done videos for 1 light and 2 light cinematography, whereas this is the 3 light one. And if you want to see those older videos, then please do look on the blog post or in the description. I'll have links to all that stuff. So let's take a look at our first setup. So the idea with this one is I'm going to be filming a live session with a singer-songwriter, so I wanted to try out a lighting setup that would work really well for someone who's playing the guitar. So the first thing I did is I set up my camera, and then I decided to actually leave that window open so that we could have some of that natural light falling in. I really liked the way that it reflected off the piano as well as accenting those pictures in the background, but of course also it served as a really good rim light just kind of outlining our subject. Now I've also got the F&V R300 ring light hidden on top of that bookcase, but for now let's just ignore that because that was actually the last light I set up. So the first one I set up was my key light, and in this case I had my cheap fluorescent with the high CRI bulbs on a C-stand, and I actually had to rearrange all of the furniture in the room so that I could get this in the right place. The thing to pay attention to when you're setting up your key light is the ratio between the lighter and the darker side of their face. So I'm going to talk a lot more about this later on, but for now let's just say that I put the light at about 90 degrees from the camera, and then I used plenty of diffusion, which would bring up that fill side of the face. So the diffusion is simply from a 5-in-1 reflector. I just put it on a light stand with a reflector clip and a swivel head, and that way I could position it exactly where I wanted it, and that's a setup I use all the time. So the next thing to do was to set up my Aperture AL528 LED. Now this light is purely there to reflect off the guitar, so I turned the brightness way down so that it wouldn't affect the rest of my scene. Now the key with getting reflections is to look through your camera's viewfinder and then basically move the light around until you can see it in the screen. And then also you're going to use plenty of diffusion so that you can't see those individual LED bulbs. So in this case I rigged up the Kupo combi clamp to the C-stand that has my key light on it, and then I just dropped in another reflector clamp to hold up the reflector's diffusion panel. Again, I'm using those 5-in-1 diffusion panels. So by turning our key light off we can really see what that reflection is doing for the shot, and then if I turn the key light back on again then we can see exactly what we've got so far. And when the guitar moves around a lot, that's when you can really see how that reflection is working. And the final step is to add our R300 ring light with the orange gel bouncing off the ceiling, and I've actually hidden it on top of the bookcase. That's the benefit of using such a small LED, and I think this really does add quite a lot to the scene. And you could say that this kind of motivates our key light by giving the audience a reason why there would be light coming from that side of the room. But to be honest, I think that's a bit of a stretch. I just like the way it looks. So the next one is a wide shot, and the first thing to do is to kind of black out our room so that we have a blank canvas to go from. So usually this would mean getting some black wrap and taping it up against the windows, but for me I didn't have to since it was already dark outside. So once I've got darkness, I like to add in my key light. In this case I'm using the Pixar Pro LED 100D, which is a really high powered LED, and I've got it on a C-stand as usual, and then this is kind of on the camera right side and sort of perpendicular to the camera, and you can see that it gives a lot of shadow on the inside of the face. But I'm a big fan of soft diffused lighting, so the good thing about this light is that it has a S-type mount, which is really useful because I can basically just bring in industry standard modifiers. In this case I used a giant octagonal softbox, and this just really softens those shadows and I think helps to make it look really cinematic. And then I'm also going to add a grid, which is really good because it keeps that kind of soft light, but it stops it from filling the whole room, and it keeps it just kind of in that one beam, which is really useful because that's the problem I have with soft light, is that it does just fill the room and then you haven't got any darkness left. So in this case that was a really helpful tool. So next I added a rim light. In this case it was just through the doorway so that it was as close as possible to being in the frame. I'm just using the classic setup of a lightweight LED, again the AL528S, on a cheap light stand with a swivel head along with a sandbag. Now this light gives us that separation between the background, and it also gives us some nice variation in the skin tones because it's kind of accenting the darker side of the face. So looking at our scene with just that rim light really does help you to see exactly what that light is doing. So the other thing I did is I added my R300 ring light. In this case we're just kind of lighting up the left side of the frame so that we don't have such a strong vignette. And this is what's so great about using that directional light, is that if we hadn't used that on the key light, then the whole room would have just been kind of equally bright. So this allows us to have it dark, and then we can add another light, and then we can exactly fine tune how bright we want that little corner to be. So that's a really useful thing, although I will say that looking back on it I would have liked to use some diffusion so that we didn't have such kind of specular highlights on that jug. Now the other thing is I'm not really liking those dark rooms in the background, so this is where it would have worked a lot better if I'd done it during daylight. So that is what I recommend, is that you kind of block out the room that you're in, but then do let some light into the other rooms. Or if not, if you are doing it in the evening, which I guess is kind of unlikely, but if you are, then you just have to kind of get some more lights, or maybe use some lighting that was already there. However, lighting isn't just about people, so for this next shot of a cutlery drawer, I really wanted some reflections off the cutlery. Now the best way to do this was to get the LED 100D. So because it has such a large, soft light source, that is just absolutely perfect for getting those reflections. And because that light is so powerful, I could stop down to f5.6 so I could have the depth of field that I wanted, and I could also add plenty of diffusion, and I still wasn't even on full power, so that having that really bright light source is really useful in all kinds of situations. So the other thing I wanted to do was have a kind of rim light around the hand, so I added again my AL528S, and in this case it was just kind of almost right behind the camera and only just out of frame. And then the final thing to do was to bring in my R300, which is just kind of accenting the right hand side of the drawer where I just thought it was a bit too dark. Now I said that I would explain lighting ratios better, so I've actually done a setup which is purely there just to kind of explain that. So the basics are that if we set up just one light, in this case the LED 100D, and I'm using it 45 degrees away from the camera so that one side of the face falls deep into shadow. Now this is what's known as low-key lighting, and the cliche example would be to light a villain like this. Now, usually we bring in a second light to bring up the exposure on the other side of their face, so it doesn't have such a dramatic look. Now, I'm using the AL528S on this case with some diffusion. So now we have very precise control over our key to fill ratio. If we just put the light directly in front of the subject, we would have had very flat lighting ratio. So the idea is that you move the lights to the side, traditionally 45 degrees, although that's a guide, definitely not a rule, and then use the fill light to determine how dark you want that other side of their face to be. Now, key to fill ratio is pretty much one of the most important parts of lighting, so once you've nailed it, then it's really useful because you can use it as a storytelling device. So hopefully you've learned something about lighting. As usual, I'm going to have all of the links to where you can find the gear that I used in this video on the blog post, and I've also embedded some videos that have taught me loads about lighting, and also ones that are just kind of really inspirational. So that's it for this week, and I'll see you next time.